The Holy Gospel according to Luke.
Glory to you, O Lord.
On the first day of the week, at early dawn, the women went to the tomb, taking the spices that they had prepared. They found the stone rolled away from the tomb, but when they went in, they did not find the body. While they were perplexed about this, suddenly 2 men in dazzling clothes stood beside them, and the women were terrified and bowed their faces to the ground. But the men said to them, "Why do you look for the living among the dead? He is not here, but he has risen. Remember how he told you, while he was still in Galilee, that the Son of Man must be handed over to the hands of sinners and be crucified on the 3rd day and rise again." Then they remembered his words. And returning from the tomb, they told all of this to the 11 and all of the rest. Now, it was Mary Magdalene and Joanna and Mary, the mother of James, and the other women with them who told this to the apostles. But these words, they seemed like idle tale, and they did not believe them. But Peter got up and ran to the tomb. Stooping and looking in, he saw the linen clothes by themselves. And then he went home, amazed at what had happened. This is the gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, O Christ. You may be seated. On a recent family trip, I got to visit a swamp. And let me tell you, it was about what I expected, maybe a little bit better. And I was there with my partner and with my cousin. And at this sanctuary, as we're walking around, we got a little booklet that kind of told us a little bit about the different plants and animals that we might see along the way. And so I flipped through it on our way to start walking around, and I really wanted to see the gray polypody. It's a type of fern, and it just really captured my attention. So we set out on the 2.5-mile boardwalk, luckily above the swamp, thanks be to God. And we went on our way to find alligators and turtles and air plants and the gray polypody. Now, I'm fairly certain that as we were walking along, I was the only one who was looking for this gray polypody. I mean, about a half-mile in, I finally asked my partner and my cousin, I said, "So have you seen it?" And I'm pretty sure that both of them cared more about an Instagram-worthy photo than about looking for some fern that caught my attention in a booklet. So, after I asked the question, though, my cousin, she said, "Oh, there's one right over there." And so I looked at it, and then I looked at the drawing in the booklet, and what she had pointed out didn't look like the drawing at all. And so I said, "Yeah, I think that's probably too big." And so I looked down at the ground again, and I looked at the picture in my booklet, and I looked at the ground again, and I kept looking around, at which point my partner, who I think was getting rather frustrated that I was slowing down his fitness walk, said, "Do you remember what you read in the book at the beginning? Didn't it say that it grows on trees and on tree limbs?" And so there I was. I started looking up from the ground, and sure enough, he was right, but we won't tell him that. I was just like, "Oh, look, they're over there." And so I began looking at all of the trunks and all of the branches of the trees, and to my surprise, they had actually been around us all along. It was on this branch and that fallen tree that these little ferns were making themselves known. Well, in today's gospel, Mary Magdalene and Joanna, along with Mary, the mother of James, and, as Luke puts it, other women, were perplexed at the empty tomb. After all, that was not what they expected to find. No, let's not forget. These women had been with Jesus in Galilee. They traveled with him to Jerusalem, and they witnessed his gruesome and shameful execution. And remember, this execution wasn't something new. This was a very commonplace scene that was familiar in the Roman Empire as the empire tried to keep hold of its citizens. So these women, it wasn't just that they happened to be around, but rather they were following Jesus. In fact, the Bible tells us that Joanna and Mary Magdalene, not only did they travel with Jesus throughout his ministry, but they were key financial supporters of Jesus' ministry. They would give money to Jesus and the disciples to go about their work. The women, they knew Jesus well. They knew his teachings, and they likely heard Jesus say at least once that he would be crucified and would rise again. Yet it wasn't until those men in dazzling clothing, I like to think of them as a gay couple, fabulously dressed, but nevertheless not in the scriptures. It was those men in dazzling clothes that told them to remember what Jesus said. And then it finally clicked. They finally understood what Jesus meant, and they went and they told the disciples. These women, not men, these women were the first apostles who went to share the good news. But as is typical in Luke's gospel, the disciples, they're a little bit slower to understand what is going on. So it was only Peter who got up and ran to the tomb to see for himself. You see, it was their remembering that the empty tomb, in their remembering, in that empty tomb, that it finally made sense. It was in remembering that they were transformed. It was in remembering that the resurrection became real. And you see, that's the thing about Easter, about the resurrection. In fact, about our God, is that remembering is essential. Now, here's where things get really interesting. When we think of the opposite of remember, what do we usually think of? To forget. I thought you'd all say that. Yet, linguistically speaking, the root of remember is the same as dismember. See the similar root here? The common root means limb or member of the body. In essence, remember and dismember are built on the same concept. To remember means to bring a part of something, bring the parts of something, right, like a story or a person, to bring those parts back together in your mind. While dismember is to take the limbs apart and break up the body, either literally or metaphorically. So to remember or remember is bringing things together, while dismembering is taking it apart. I think you got it, right? So, as we think about this story, we think about these women who are remembering, and we think about the opposite, dismembering. I can't help but think how easy it is for the world to want to pull apart our own bodies, our own minds, our own souls. I mean, our confidence is pulled apart as the world tries endlessly to convince us that money and power and privilege are our only defining characteristics. The world, over and over again, has individuals and groups of people who are in power who try to rewrite history and gaslight our experiences to break apart the commonality and the understanding that is in remembering. You see, when institutions that serve the poor and the marginalized are broken apart under the guise of efficiency, we as a people are dismembered. When we are told that we are not pretty enough, or rich enough, or straight enough, or masculine enough, or white enough, or rich enough, we as a people, we are dismembered. When we are tricked into believing that our actions have no impact whatsoever on the environment and on our own local communities, because we are all so ruggedly independent, we are dismembered. And you see, when Jesus was nailed to a cross, the spear thrust into his side, and shamed by those religious leaders and humiliated by the political empire, their intent was to ensure that no one would ever recall or claim or be associated with this crazy Jesus guy. They wanted to completely dismember him. And so that's the thing, though, about Easter, is today we didn't forget the story. In fact, we heard the stories from those women at the tomb who remembered Jesus. They had come to cover the stench of his rotting flesh in the darkest places imaginable, but instead they found resurrection. They were the first to understand that when the world tries to dismember us as a people, we remember. When the powers that be try to shame us into never telling the true story, we, like those women, we go and we tell it. When the world says, look over here at the latest headline, at this funny video, or your chance to finally make it famous, God says, remember. Remember how back in Genesis, God remembered Noah and the animals. God remembered Abraham and Lot. God remembered the Israelites. God remembered Hannah. And then God got in this business of being the king of remembering, the king rememberer, if you will, the one who comes down and becomes the holy reminderer, if you follow that, so that God then goes and reminds the Israelites of whose they are. And over again, we hear of this happening. They forget, Jesus reminds them. They forget Jesus, or God reminds them. They forget, God reminds them. And you see, if that wasn't enough, then Jesus is inviting us to remember. I mean, remember Jesus, how he ate with the poor and the outcasts and the prostitutes. Remember how Jesus had a meal with those who sold themselves out to the political empire of the time. Remember how he shared a meal with the one who betrayed him. Remember how we are all invited to share in the breaking of the bread. And so each time we gather here, we remember that Jesus said, do this in remembrance of me. It's no accident. You see, this is the central mystery of our faith together. Namely, that in breaking apart the bread, we are actually remembering. You get this? In tearing apart, in ripping apart a common loaf, we are actually unified together. We are brought back as one. For you see, the resurrection is about remembering, and the story is only crucified and forgotten if we dismember it and leave it untold. That is because remembering at its core is an act of resistance. We resist hate when we tell the story of love. We resist division when we tell the story of unity. We resist retribution when we tell the story of grace. And friends, that is the story that Jesus and our God tells over and over again. It is the story that we need to hear time and again. And so each time that you, that I, that we speak this story of love, that we share the story of love, that we live out the story of love, well, we are participating in that holy remembering. And we literally become a part of the resurrection. For the resurrection was not just about a single event 2,000 years ago across the pond, but rather, resurrection is among us in the little ways of love found in those unexpected places. And so that was the thing about that good old gray polypody. Even though I had read that this little fern would be on the trunk or the branch, I didn't quite get it. It didn't sink in. It wasn't until I remembered what I was told that I finally saw that fern that I was seeking. And now the real interesting thing about this little fern that I've learned since then is that it has incredible persistence. In the deepest of droughts, it actually curls up and flips its leaves upside down. And it does that to preserve itself from drying out completely. But then when the rains fall again, it brings the water back into its leaves and it unfurls again to look lush and vibrant once more. Which is why you may know this little gray polypody as, anybody know what it is? No botanists in the house. I can make up anything I want. This is great. So it's actually called the resurrection fern. So friends, in conclusion, there is so much to be learned from our God's gift of creation and from God's gift of love. May we on this Easter Sunday recall all of the ways that God has always remembered us from the very beginning. And may we too, not out of obligation, but out of opportunity, may we then be about God's holy remembering. As we embody Christ's resurrection this day and always, for we remember that in our remembering, Christ is risen. Christ is risen indeed. Alleluia.